Dust Hollow wasn't a town. It was a judgment. It sat in a shallow depression in the earth, as if God had pressed a thumb into the plains and found the spot wanting. The wind, when it blew, didn't bring relief. Only a finer grit of sand that worked its way into the seams of your clothes, the lines of your face, and the silence between words. There was no vibrant chatter here, only the creak of a sign for the general store, the weary plod of a mule, and the low, murmuring tones of business conducted in shadows. The buildings were the color of sun-bleached bone, their false fronts leaning against one another for support. Much like the people themselves, they were a community bound not by fellowship, but by a shared, unspoken agreement to mind one's own affairs. Law in Dust Hollow was less about justice and more about order, and order was maintained by a rigid set of rules, the most important of which was to not get involved. To see nothing, to say nothing, was to survive. Into this crucible of quiet condemnation, they brought Clarabelle. She stood on a small, raised wooden platform in the center of the market square, a place usually reserved for selling livestock or announcing territorial decrees. But today, she was the spectacle. Her wrists, raw and red, were bound by thick rope to a rough-hewn hitching post. Her calico dress, once a cheerful pattern of blue flowers, was torn at the shoulder and hem, smeared with the dirt of a long and unwilling journey. Her hair, the color of autumn wheat, had come loose from its braid and fell in tangled strands around a face that was pale beneath a layer of grime. She was young, perhaps 19, with eyes the color of a stormy sky that darted across the assembly, searching for something she knew she would not find. Her crime, as declared by the portly magistrate, Mr. Abernathy, was breach of a legally binding contract of servitude. He had read the charge from a scroll with a flourish, his voice booming with a self-importance that seemed to suck the very air from the square. The words were clean, official, and utterly devoid of the truth. Clarabelle had not entered into a contract. She had been sold. Her father, a man broken by drink and debt, had signed a paper that traded her for a handful of silver dollars under the guise of sponsorship. She was to work at the Black Creek mining camp for a period of 5 years to pay off a debt that was not her own. Sponsorship, they called it, a cage by any other name. The camp was a place of mud and misery, where men's hopes were ground into dust alongside the rock they chiseled from the earth. For 6 months, she had cooked and cleaned for 24 men, her days a blur of soot, grease, and the constant leering gazes that made her skin crawl. There was no kindness, no respite, only the unspoken threat of what would happen if she ever faltered. So she had run, under the cover of a moonless night, with nothing but a half-loaf of bread and a canteen of water. She had fled east, toward the sunrise, toward a life she could only imagine. She had made it 3 days before the trackers found her. Now, she was being made an example of. The magistrate had decreed that a public shaming was in order, to remind all who might consider breaking their bonds that the law had a long reach. She was labeled breached property, an item to be returned to its rightful owner. The sun beat down on her, hot and merciless, and the whispers of the townspeople were like the buzzing of flies. They stood in small, tight clusters, the blacksmith with his arms like tree trunks crossed over his leather apron, the preacher with his Bible clutched to his chest, the women with their shopping baskets held like shields. They looked, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and detached pity, but their eyes never truly met hers. To meet her gaze would be to acknowledge her humanity, and to acknowledge that was to become complicit in a story they wanted no part of. The law of cooperation with the magistrate's office was a powerful deterrent. It stipulated that any citizen who interfered with the execution of a legal judgment, or who failed to report a fugitive, would face fines, confiscation of property, or even imprisonment. It was a law designed to turn neighbors into sentinels, to weave a net of fear that kept everyone in their place. And so, they watched as if she were a play unfolding on a stage. A brief and tragic diversion from the monotony of their lives. They saw a girl in trouble, but they also saw the magistrate's men standing at the edge of the square, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. Helping her was a risk no one in Dust Hollow was willing to take. A group of 4 men detached themselves from the crowd and approached the platform. They were from the Black Creek camp, their faces hard and sun-cracked, their clothes stained with the red mud of the mines. The one in the lead, a bull of a man named Silas Croft, who served as the camp's foreman, held a piece of paper in his hand, the contract. As per the agreement with her father and the ruling of Magistrate Abernathy, Silas announced, his voice a gravelly rumble. This girl is to be returned to our custody to fulfill the remainder of her term. The cost of her retrieval and the time lost from her duties must be compensated. He looked not at Clarabelle, but at the other men, a smirk playing on his lips. This was not just about retrieving a worker. It was a sport. Now hold on, Silas. Another man stepped forward, a wiry fellow with a nervous twitch in his eye named Jebediah. My stake in the camp is just as big as yours. I put up the coin that paid for her. I say she works for me first to pay off my investment. She was cooking for my crew. A third man, burly and bearded, grunted. We lost a week of good work because we had to make our own grub. The compensation should go to us. The argument began. A low and ugly negotiation right in front of her. They weren't talking about her. They were talking about a commodity. They haggled over her future as if they were bidding on a mule. Clarabelle felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her trembling grew more violent, a tremor that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out their voices, trying to retreat to a place deep inside herself where they couldn't reach her. But their words were like sharp stones, pelting her, reminding her of her powerlessness. I'll cover the retrieval fee myself, Silas declared, trying to assert his authority. $3 for the trackers. She can work it off in my personal quarters. Keep the mess hall clean. He winked at the other men, and a round of coarse laughter followed. The sound cut through Clarabelle's despair like a knife. Her eyes snapped open. The fear that had been paralyzing her curdled into something else, something hot and sharp, rage, a desperate, hopeless rage. Her spirit, which she thought had been broken, stirred with a final, defiant pulse. She would not be an animal inspected at market. She would not be a piece of property bartered and sold. Even if she could not be free, she would hold on to this last shred of herself. Her gaze swept across the crowd one last time, past the averted eyes and the blank, pitiless faces. She was looking for just one person, anyone, who wasn't looking at her as if she were already dead. And then she saw him. He was half hidden in the long, dark shadow cast by the livery stable, a place where the smells of hay and horse sweat offered a dusty reprieve from the human stench of the town square. He sat atop a rangy roan gelding, a horse as travel-worn and quiet as its rider. The man was a study in stillness, a stark contrast to the agitated shuffle of the townsfolk and the boisterous haggling of the miners. He was tall in the saddle, with shoulders that spoke of strength but slumped with a weariness that went deeper than muscle. A thick, untrimmed beard, the color of dark soil, obscured the lower half of his face, and a wide-brimmed hat, stained and misshapen by sun and rain, was pulled low, casting his eyes in perpetual shadow. His clothes, denim trousers, faded to the color of a pale sky, and a rough spun shirt were coated in the same alkali dust as his boots and saddlebags. He looked as if he had been carved from the very landscape he traveled through, a piece of the harsh, unforgiving wilderness given human form. No one in Dust Hollow knew his name. He had drifted into town a few weeks prior, a silent specter who took a room at the boarding house, paid in coin, and spoke to no one. He didn't frequent the saloon for whiskey or cards, nor did he attend the Sunday service to wash his soul. He simply came and went, his comings marked by the rhythmic clop of his horse's hooves on the main street, his goings by an absence that was almost as palpable as his presence. The town, in its need to label and understand everything, had settled on a name for him, the mute cowboy. It was a name born of observation and suspicion. His silence was not shy or retiring. It was absolute, a wall he carried with him. When the blacksmith, a man not known for idle chatter, had tried to engage him about his horse's shoeing, the cowboy had simply nodded, pointed to the worn shoe, and paid the fee without a single word passing his lips. His silence was unnerving, an anomaly in a world where a man's worth was often measured by the weight of his words or the speed of his gun. On this day, as with most days, he was just an observer on the fringe of things. He wasn't a part of the market's commerce. He had no goods to sell, and he showed no interest in buying. He simply sat on his horse, one hand resting loosely on the saddle horn, the other on his thigh. He watched the proceedings in the square with an unnerving placidity, his posture unchanging, his breathing slow and even. He seemed less like a man and more like a feature of the town's architecture, permanent and unmoving. From beneath the brim of his hat, his gaze was a fixed point, a dark and steady thing in the shimmering heat. There was no flicker of interest, no hint of judgment, no trace of emotion at all. It was as if he had seen so much of the world's ugliness and beauty that nothing was left to surprise him, nothing left to stir the ashes of whatever feelings he might once have possessed. Clarabelle's desperate, spinning mind knew nothing of this man. Her world had shrunk to the rough circumference of the hitching post and the suffocating circle of leering faces. The voices of Silas Croft and the other miners had become a meaningless drone, the buzzing of insects before a storm. Panic was a physical thing inside her, a wild bird beating its wings against her ribs, stealing her breath. She had to look away from them, from their greedy, possessive eyes that stripped her bare and appraised her worth in dollars and cents. Her gaze flew from one face to another, a frantic, silent plea for help, for recognition, for anything other than this cold, morbid curiosity. She saw Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, her lips pressed into a thin, virtuous line of disapproval, as if Clarabelle's very existence was a personal affront to her piety. She saw Mr. Finch, the owner of the general store, squinting and rubbing his chin, calculating profit and loss, his mind likely tallying the cost of the rope used to bind her. She saw children, their eyes wide and uncomprehending, being pulled away by mothers who whispered warnings about what happens to girls who don't follow the rules. Every face was a stone wall. Every averted glance was a confirmation of her isolation. They were all witnesses, yet none of them truly saw her. They saw a problem, a spectacle, a warning. They saw the breached property the magistrate had named her. They saw anything and everything but the terrified young woman whose only crime had been to seek freedom. The hope she had clung to moments before, that spark of rage, began to flicker and die, starved of oxygen in the vacuum of their indifference. A cold, heavy despair began to settle in her bones. This was it. This was the end of her life. She would be dragged back to the camp, her spirit finally and completely broken, and she would live out her days as a thing, an object for use and disposal. The sun beat down. The dust tickled her throat, and the world began to tilt and fade at the edges. And then, through the blur of unshed tears and the shimmering waves of heat rising from the ground, her frantic search ended. Her eyes landed on the shadow by the livery stable. She saw the horse first, then the man, a dark, still shape against the bleached wood of the barn. He was different from the others. He wasn't part of the jeering, whispering circle. He was separate, an island of stillness in the churning sea of the crowd. He was looking right at her. For a heart-stopping moment, she expected the same look, the judgment, the pity, the avarice, but it wasn't there. As her vision cleared, as her focus narrowed on this one solitary figure, she saw his eyes from beneath the shadow of his hat, and the world, for a single, breathless second, fell completely silent. His gaze was not kind. It was not gentle. There was no softness in it, no comforting promise of rescue. But it was also devoid of everything she feared. There was no contempt in it, no hungry spark of opportunity, no cold satisfaction at her plight. There was no pity. That terrible, condescending emotion that would have confirmed her status as a victim. His look was something far rarer, and in that moment, far more powerful. It was a look of pure, unadorned observation. He was not looking at her situation. He was looking at her. In the space of that shared glance, across the 30 yards of sun-baked earth that separated them, a strange transaction occurred. He did not offer her hope, but he offered her something she hadn't realized. She had lost her own existence. The other 100 eyes in the square saw a category, a runaway, a sinner, an object of law. His eyes, dark and unreadable, simply saw a person. He saw Clarabelle. The wild bird in her chest stopped its frantic beating. The nausea receded. The drone of the miners' voices faded into the background. For the first time since they had dragged her into the square, she felt the solid ground beneath her worn shoes. He did not smile. He did not nod. He did not move a muscle. He just watched, his gaze as steady and unyielding as the distant mesas on the horizon. It was a silent, profound acknowledgement. You are there. I see you. In that desolate, sun-scorched square, surrounded by enemies and silent bystanders, that simple, silent acknowledgement was everything. It was a splinter of wood to a drowning woman. It was a single, clean breath in a suffocating room. It was not a promise of salvation, but it was a testament that she was still here to be saved. And in the heart of Clarabelle, a new and different kind of courage began to take root, one born not of rage, but of having been truly seen. The argument between the miners devolved into a brutish spectacle of entitlement. They stood in a tight knot before the platform, their voices rising in the hot, still air, their gestures growing wider and more aggressive. They had forgotten, or perhaps had never considered, that the object of their dispute was a living, breathing person standing mere feet away. To them, she was a complication, a piece of machinery that had malfunctioned and now required a decision on its ownership and repair. "I've settled the matter," Silas Croft said, his voice a low growl of finality. He held up $3 silver between a thick thumb and forefinger, the coins glinting in the merciless sun. "This covers the bounty for the trackers. It's my coin, my loss. That gives me first claim. She's mine until the debt is worked off." He spoke the word mine with a grating possessiveness, as if he were branding her with the sound alone. "Your coin," Jebediah scoffed, his wiry frame practically vibrating with indignation. "It was my capital that bought her father's signature on that contract in the first place. My investment is the foundation of this whole arrangement. The retrieval fee is a secondary expense. Primary claim rests with the primary investor." Bartholomew, the third man, shoved his way between them. "A plague on both your investments. What about my lost labor? My crew's been eating hardtack and salt pork for a week because she wasn't there to cook. That's a loss of morale, a loss of productivity. The contract stipulates she provides domestic labor for the camp as a whole, not just for the man holding the purse strings." They bickered on, their words weaving a cage of commerce and law around Clarabelle that felt more substantial than the ropes on her wrists. They spoke of amortization, of principal, of contractual obligations and liquidated damages. It was the cold, cruel language of business applied to a human soul, and with every word, she felt herself disappearing, dissolving into a clause on a stained piece of paper. The terror of moments before began to return, a chilling fog creeping back into her mind. This was her future being decided, a life spent as a pawn in the petty squabbles of greedy men. But then, through the fog, she remembered the eyes, the steady, silent gaze from the shadows, the look that had not appraised her, but had simply acknowledged her. It was a tiny point of light in an overwhelming darkness, and she fixed her entire being upon it. The anchor held the world, which had been tilting, righted itself. The miners' voices became distant again, a meaningless squabble on the far side of a river. A strange and profound calm settled over her. She was not a piece of machinery. She was not a ledger entry. She was Clarabelle, and her story had not yet ended. She realized, with a clarity that was almost startling, that she had one move left. It was a desperate, foolish, impossible move. It had no logic behind it, no guarantee of success. It was nothing more than a gesture, a single, silent appeal to the only person in the entire town who had looked at her and seen a human being. It was, she knew, the last thing she would ever do as a free woman. A final act of will before the cage door slammed shut for good. Slowly, fighting the tremor in her muscles and the searing pain in her rope-burned wrists, she began to lift her right hand. The movement was agonizingly small at first, a mere twitch of her fingers. The ropes were tight, cinched to the post in a way that allowed for little motion. But she strained against them, her muscles screaming in protest. She focused on the feeling of her own sinews, her own bones, responding to her command. Inch by inch, she raised her hand. Her arm, caked in dust and streaked with sweat, trembled with the effort. The miners didn't notice at first, too engrossed in their argument. But a child in the crowd saw it. He pointed, his voice a piping treble. "Look, Ma." A ripple of awareness spread through the assembly. One by one, the whispers and murmurs ceased. The haggling stopped. Silas Croft, mid-sentence, let his words die in his throat, every eye in Dust Hollow, which had been studiously avoiding her, now snapped to her, drawn by the sheer, unexpected audacity of her movement. And in the utter, ringing silence that followed, Clarabelle, with a final surge of strength, extended one single finger. Her hand was shaking. Her arm felt as heavy as lead, but her aim was unwavering. She pointed past the bloated face of the magistrate, past the glowering miners, past the stunned and silent townspeople. She pointed across the sun-drenched square, directly into the cool, dark shadow of the livery stable. She pointed straight at the mute cowboy. The silence that had fallen upon the square deepened, becoming heavy, profound, absolute. It was as if the sun itself had been stunned into speechlessness. For a long, stretched moment, the only sound was the lazy buzz of a horsefly and the distant, lonely creak of a weather vane. The entire town held its collective breath, caught in a tableau of disbelief. A girl, bound and condemned, had just made a choice. Then the spell shattered. A man from the back of the crowd, a grizzled old prospector, let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Well, I'll be," he cackled. "The property picks its own owner." The tension broke in a wave of murmurs and scornful chuckles. The absurdity of the situation struck them all at once. Silas Croft's face turned a dangerous shade of purple, a mixture of fury and humiliation. "What is this nonsense?" he bellowed, turning to follow the direction of her finger. His eyes landed on the silent figure on the roan horse. He sneered. "She's pointing at him, the mute." Another voice, sharp and mocking, cut through the air. "She's choosing that one. What's he gonna do? Stare at you till you hand her over. What good is a man with no tongue?" The crowd, emboldened, joined in the ridicule. They had been afraid of the law, afraid of the miners. But this man, this silent outcast, they did not fear. He was a ghost, a non-entity. He was a safe target for the venom they had kept bottled up. "Maybe she likes the quiet type," someone shouted, and a fresh wave of laughter rolled through the square. Through it all, Clarabelle kept her arm outstretched, her finger pointed. It was taking every ounce of her remaining strength. Her vision swam, and black spots danced at the edges. But she would not lower it. It was her declaration, her vote, her final, desperate prayer. She had thrown her last stone into the water, and now she could only wait for the ripples. The mute cowboy did not move. He sat his horse in the shadows as the taunts and jeers rained down around him. He did not flinch, did not react in any way. His face, hidden by his hat and beard, remained an unreadable mask. It seemed, for a terrible moment, that he would do nothing, that he would simply watch, as he always did. and let the scene play out to its inevitable conclusion. Clarabelle's heart plummeted. The hope that had so briefly and fiercely ignited began to sputter, starved of its fuel. But then something shifted. It was not a large movement. He simply gathered his reins, his hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. The leather creaked softly, a sound that cut through the noise of the crowd. He nudged the flank of the roan with his heel, and with a slow, unhurried gait, the mute cowboy rode out of the shadows. He guided his horse from the cool darkness of the livery's overhang into the full, brutal glare of the midday sun. The light caught the dust on his hat, creating a momentary, hazy halo. It illuminated the weary lines around his eyes and the grim set of his mouth, which had been hidden before. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the furious miners. His gaze was fixed, steady and intense, on Clarabelle. He stopped his horse in the open, a silent, solitary figure who had just stepped onto the stage. He still had not spoken a word, but his presence now filled the square, and everyone, from the magistrate to the laughing prospector, fell silent once more. The world seemed to shrink to the space between Clarabelle and the man on the horse. The insults of the crowd, the furious sputtering of Silas Croft, all of it faded into a dull, distant roar. The cowboy's eyes, still fixed on hers, were the only anchor in a swirling sea of chaos. He had accepted her silent plea, stepped into the light, and now the entire weight of the moment rested on his silent shoulders. With a movement that was fluid and unhurried, he swung his leg over the back of his saddle and dismounted. His boots hit the ground with a soft thud, sending up 2 small puffs of golden dust. He stood for a moment by his horse's head, giving the animal a soft, almost imperceptible pat on the neck, a small, private gesture in a very public space. Then he began to walk. He moved not toward the miners who were now shouting at him, nor toward Clarabelle on her platform of shame. He walked directly toward the rickety wooden table where Magistrate Abernathy sat, his face a mask of pompous confusion. The cowboy's stride was long and even, the walk of a man accustomed to covering great distances. The jingle of his spurs was a quiet, rhythmic counterpoint to the agitated murmur of the crowd. He did not look left or right. His focus was singular, his purpose a palpable force that seemed to push the air aside. People instinctively shuffled back, clearing a path for him as if he were a sleepwalker they were afraid to wake. He reached the table and stopped. He stood before the magistrate, a tall, dust-covered figure eclipsing the sun for the portly official. He said nothing. He simply reached into a small leather pouch that hung from his belt, a pouch so worn and supple it looked like a part of him. His fingers dipped inside for a moment before withdrawing. When his hand emerged, it was closed in a fist. He held it over the center of the table, over the scattered papers and the inkwell, and then he opened it. A single coin dropped from his palm. It was not silver, it was not copper, it was gold, a $20 double eagle, heavy and bright, catching the noon sun and throwing it back in a dazzling flash. It did not clink or tinkle. It hit the warped wood of the table with a solid, definitive thud that seemed to echo in the sudden, absolute silence. The sound was so final, so utterly incongruous with the petty squabbling that had preceded it, that it seemed to stun the very air. That one small circle of gold, lying there in the sun, changed everything. It was more than money. It was a statement of power so profound and simple that it made all other arguments irrelevant. The 3 silver dollars Silas Croft still clutched in his fist suddenly looked like cheap, pitiful trinkets. The legal papers Magistrate Abernathy held seemed flimsy and meaningless. In the West, talk was wind and paper could burn, but gold was the final, unassailable law. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Whispers erupted like wildfire. "A double eagle!" Someone breathed in awe. "That's half a year's wages for some." Their scorn for the silent stranger evaporated in an instant, replaced by a potent mixture of shock, envy, and raw curiosity. Who was this man, this mute, who could so casually discard a fortune? Magistrate Abernathy stared at the coin as if it were a venomous snake. His face, which had been flushed with self-importance, was now pale with a different kind of emotion—greed, tempered by confusion. He looked from the gleaming gold up to the shadowed face of the man who had placed it there. He cleared his throat, his authority suddenly feeling as flimsy as his cheap linen collar. "What is the meaning of this?" he stammered, his voice losing its booming quality. This is a significant sum." He looked at Silas Croft, whose face was a thunderous mask of disbelief and rage. "The matter at hand is the settlement of a breached contract. The retrieval fee is $3, and the restitution for—" The cowboy interrupted him, not with a word, but with a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. His eyes, dark and piercing, never left the magistrate's. Abernathy faltered. He licked his dry lips. He looked back at the coin, his gaze drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The entire legal and moral structure of the situation had been upended. This was no longer about a runaway servant. This was about the gold piece sitting on his table. "You," the magistrate began, his voice barely a whisper. He gestured vaguely toward Clarabelle with a trembling hand. "You wish to acquire the contract to take responsibility for her." The cowboy did not move, save for his eyes. They shifted from the magistrate to Silas Croft, holding the miner's enraged glare for a long moment. There was no challenge in his look, only a flat, calm statement of fact. Then he looked back at Abernathy, and he nodded. One single, slow, deliberate dip of his head. It was his answer. It was his signature. It was his entire argument. A howl of outrage erupted from Silas Croft. "You can't do that. She is property of the Black Creek mining concern. We have a contract signed and sealed. This is illegal." Magistrate Abernathy, however, had already made his calculation. The law was the law, but the law could be reinterpreted, especially when lubricated by gold. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice regaining a measure of its official tone, though it was now aimed at a new target. "The contract is fundamentally a financial instrument, a guarantee against a debt. This stranger has offered a sum that more than covers the entirety of the original debt, the retrieval fees, and any punitive damages you could possibly claim. In the eyes of the law, a settled debt is a closed matter. The contract is satisfied." He reached out a slightly trembling hand and placed it protectively over the gold coin. "The matter is closed." "Closed! He can't just buy her!" Croft roared, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. But the magistrate's men, who had been standing idly by, now stepped forward, their expressions firm. They were lawmen, and the magistrate, holding the gold, now represented the law. Silas was outmaneuvered, his blustering threats rendered impotent by a single, silent gesture. He looked around for support, but his fellow miners, Jebediah and Bartholomew, were staring at the gold coin with the looks of naked avarice, likely calculating their share. The townspeople just watched, their faces unreadable. He was alone, defeated. He spat on the ground and uttered a string of curses, but the fight had gone out of him. "Unlock her," Abernathy commanded one of his men. The deputy approached the platform, a ring of iron keys jangling at his belt. Clarabelle watched him come, her mind a numb buzz of disbelief. She was so focused on the cowboy, who had not moved, that she barely registered the deputy fumbling with the lock on her manacles. She heard a metallic click, and then the heavy iron cuffs fell away from her wrists. The sudden release of pressure sent a tingling, painful sensation through her arms. Then came the ropes. The deputy's knife sawed through the thick hemp, and with a final scrape, her hands were free. She stood there on the platform, untethered for the first time in days, yet she felt more adrift than ever. Her wrists were raw, bleeding slightly. She rubbed them, the simple sensation of her own touch a foreign feeling. It was over. She was free. But what did that mean? Had she just been traded from one owner to another? She looked at the cowboy, who stood like a statue by the table, his face giving away nothing. Was he her savior, or just a wealthier master? The fear that had receded now returned, cold and sharp. The unknown was as terrifying as the certainty she had just escaped. Having concluded the transaction, the cowboy turned, not toward her, but toward his horse. He walked back with the same unhurried pace, every eye in the square following his every move. He reached the roan, took the reins in his hand, and for a heart-stopping moment, it looked as if he was simply going to mount and ride away. Clarabelle's breath caught in her throat. A wave of ice-cold panic washed over her. He had paid the price, settled the score, and now he was leaving her here, alone and unprotected in the center of this hostile town. The crowd began to murmur, the same thought occurring to them. Had he done it all for nothing? A grand, pointless gesture? Was this some new, crueler kind of humiliation? He put his foot in the stirrup. But he didn't swing himself up. He stopped. He stood there for a long second, his back to her, a silhouette against the harsh light. Then, slowly, he turned his head. He looked over his shoulder, his gaze finding hers once more across the square. And then, he lifted his hand. It was not a command. It was not a summons. He simply held it out, palm slightly upturned, fingers relaxed. It was a silent invitation, an offer, a question hanging in the air. Will you come? Clarabelle stood frozen on the platform, the splintered wood beneath her feet. Below her was the town of Dust Hollow, a circle of hostile, judgmental faces. Behind her was the life of servitude at Black Creek. Before her was this man, this stranger, this impossible enigma, and his outstretched hand. He offered no promises, no explanations, no words of comfort. He offered only a direction away. Taking a shaky breath, she made her choice. She took one step, then another, moving to the edge of the platform. Without looking down, she stepped off it and onto the dusty ground. Her legs were weak, but she did not falter. She kept her eyes on him as she walked, closing the distance between them. The crowd parted for her as it had for him, their whispers dying as she passed. She did not take his hand. She simply stopped when she reached his side, her gaze level with his horse's saddle. It was enough. He lowered his hand, turned, and swung himself onto the roan in one smooth, practiced motion. Then he looked down at her and, for the first time, she saw something flicker in the depths of his shadowed eyes. It wasn't kindness. Not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was acceptance. He reached down, and with an effortless strength, took her hand and swung her up to sit in front of him on the saddle. Without a backward glance at the town, the magistrate, or the gold coin still gleaming on the table, he spurred his horse into a walk, and together, they rode out of Dust Hollow. The moment the last ramshackle building of Dust Hollow disappeared behind a low rise of earth, the world changed. The oppressive, buzzing silence of the town was replaced by a different kind, one that was vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. It was the silence of a land that had seen mountains rise and crumble, a silence that swallowed the plodding rhythm of the horse's hooves and the soft creak of saddle leather, leaving nothing in their place. They rode into a landscape bleached by a relentless sun. The plain stretched out before them, a sea of pale grass and cracked earth, broken only by the occasional skeletal form of a yucca plant or a stubborn patch of sagebrush. The sky was a searing, cloudless blue, a merciless bowl that offered no shade and no promises. Clarabelle sat stiffly in front of the cowboy, her back held ramrod straight, careful not to lean against the solid wall of his chest. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight with a fear that was sharp and familiar. She had escaped Silas Croft in the Black Creek camp, but she had no illusions about her situation. She had been bought and paid for. The currency had been gold instead of silver. The transaction conducted in silence instead of with coarse laughter. But the fundamental nature of it, she feared, was the same. She was a possession. her fate now tied to the whims of this silent, inscrutable stranger. What did he want? The question screamed in her mind. A frantic, repeating echo. Men did not spend a fortune on a strange woman out of the goodness of their hearts. Not in this world. She waited for the hand that would snake around her waist, the gruff voice that would issue a command, the sudden turn off the path toward some hidden, desolate place where her screams would be swallowed by the wind. She waited, her senses on a knife's edge, cataloging every shift of his weight, every breath he took. But the hand never came. The voice remained silent. He rode with a steady, unwavering purpose, his hands resting lightly on the reins, his body a bastion of calm behind her. He did not crowd her or touch her unnecessarily. The space he occupied was his own, and he seemed to grant her the same unspoken courtesy. Hours bled into one another under the oppressive heat. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent toward the jagged line of the western horizon. Dust, fine as flour, settled on her skin and in her throat. Her lips cracked. The raw skin of her wrists throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. Still, he rode on, and still, he said nothing. His silence was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that covered them both. At first, it had been terrifying, a void where she projected all her worst fears. But as the miles fell away, a strange thing began to happen. The silence began to feel less like a threat and more like a shelter. In the constant, demanding noise of her life, her father's drunken ramblings, the coarse jests and orders of the miners' words had always been weapons, tools used to command, to belittle, to possess. This man's silence was different. It asked nothing of her. It did not judge her torn dress or her tangled hair. It did not demand an explanation or a show of gratitude. It simply was, and in that vast, empty quiet, for the first time in as long as she could remember, Clarabelle felt the frantic buzzing in her own mind begin to subside. Her fear did not vanish, but it loosened its suffocating grip, morphing into a wary, watchful vigilance. She was still a captive, she told herself, but she was a captive who was being allowed to breathe. As the sky began to bleed with the bruised purples and fiery oranges of sunset, he finally guided the horse off the barely there trail, moving toward a shallow arroyo flanked by a cluster of weathered rock formations. He dismounted with the same economy of motion he seemed to apply to everything, then turned and looked up at her. He made no move to pull her down. Instead, he simply stood by the horse's shoulder, waiting, taking it as her cue. Clarabelle carefully slid down from the saddle, her legs weak and trembling from the long hours of riding. They nearly buckled beneath her, but she caught herself, her pride refusing to let her show such weakness. She stood aside, wrapping her arms around herself, and watched as he went about the business of making camp. His competence was a quiet, powerful thing. First, he tended to the horse, removing the heavy saddle and blanket, rubbing the animal down with a handful of dry grass, and allowing it to drink sparingly from a canvas water bag. The animal was his partner, his means of survival, and he cared for it with a focused, gentle attention. Only when the roan was taken care of did he turn to their own needs. He gathered dry brush and twigs with a practiced eye, building a small, smokeless fire in the lee of a rock. He did not ask her to help, and she did not offer, unsure of her place, of the rules of this new, silent world. She was the observer, a ghost at the edge of his routine. From his saddlebags, he produced a worn bedroll and a single blanket. He laid the bedroll out for himself near the fire and placed the folded blanket on a patch of smooth ground a respectful distance away, an unspoken designation of her space. Finally, he retrieved a small, cloth-wrapped parcel in the canteen. He sat on his heels by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across the grim, bearded landscape of his face. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a round of hard, dry bread damper, baked in the ashes of a previous fire. It was not large. It was barely enough for one hungry man. Clarabelle watched, her stomach clenching with a familiar, hollow ache. She expected him to eat his fill, perhaps to toss her a few crumbs as an afterthought, a reward for her compliance. It was what she had come to expect. But the cowboy did not eat. He took the round of bread in his large, calloused hands and, with precise pressure, broke it cleanly in two. The pieces were almost exactly equal. He looked at them for a moment, as if weighing them, then seemed to satisfy himself. He held one of the halves out to her. His eyes met hers in the flickering firelight, and for the first time, she saw something other than that unnerving placidity. It was not emotion, precisely, but a clear, simple intent. "This is for you." Hesitantly, she stepped forward and took the bread. Her fingers brushed his, and his skin was warm and rough. The contact sent a small, unexpected jolt through her. She retreated to her spot and sat, the bread feeling heavy and precious in her hands. Next, he took the canteen. He uncorked it and, instead of drinking, he held it out to her as well. Water was life in this land, more valuable than the gold he'd left on the magistrate's table. He was giving her the first drink. She took the canteen, her thirst so powerful it was a pain in her throat. She drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched insides. She was careful not to take too much, acutely aware of their limited supply, and handed it back. He took it, drank his own portion, and then stoppered it securely. Only then did he begin to eat his half of the bread, chewing slowly, his gaze fixed on the crackling flames. Clarabelle ate her own portion, the coarse bread scraping her throat, but it was the most satisfying meal she had ever had. It was not just food, it was a message. This was not the act of a master feeding his property. This was the act of a partner sharing his meager resources. He had broken the bread in half. He had given her the first water. In his world of stark, silent gestures, these were not small things. They were declarations. He had bought her, yes, but he was not treating her as a purchase. The last of the light faded from the sky, leaving a deep, velvet blackness studded with a breathtaking spray of silver stars. The fire crackled and spat, a small circle of warmth and life in the immense, silent dark. The day's heat bled from the sand, and a cool breeze whispered through the rocks. Clarabelle pulled the blanket around her shoulders, the rough wool a comforting weight. Across the fire, the cowboy sat as still as the stones behind him, a dark silhouette against the flames. He seemed a part of the night, a piece of the vast, lonely landscape. She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a potential threat or a mysterious savior, but as a man who had seen her in her deepest moment of humiliation and had responded not with words, but with a decisive, inexplicable act. A man who now shared his fire, his food, and his water, all without asking for a single thing in return, not even her name. Her father's promises had been soaked in whiskey and broken by morning. The miner's words had been contracts of possession, filled with threats and lewd suggestions. The words of everyone in Dust Hollow had been whispers of judgment and fear. All her life, words had been used to cage her. But this man, this mute cowboy, had used none. And as she sat there, wrapped in a blanket she had been given freely, with a full stomach and quenched thirst, a profound and startling question rose in her heart. Why was it that in the presence of this silent, dangerous-looking stranger, in the middle of a vast and unforgiving wilderness, she felt safer than she had ever felt in her entire life? They rode for 2 more days. The terrain began to change on the second morning, the vast, featureless plains giving way to a broken landscape of rolling foothills and shallow, winding canyons. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The world was no longer a flat, sun-baked plate, but a place of dimension, of shadows and secrets. The cowboy guided his horse with an unerring confidence, navigating the maze of rock and scrub with a familiarity that suggested this was not a journey of escape, but a journey home. He was not running from something. He was riding toward it. Clarabelle's fear had long since subsided, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a cautious, burgeoning curiosity. She had settled into the rhythm of his presence, the quiet competence that defined his every action. The nights were the same, a small fire, a shared meal, the silent offering of the first drink in the better sleeping spot. During the day, he would occasionally point, a single, sharp gesture toward a distant butte, a soaring hawk, or the telltale shimmer of a hidden spring. These were his only communications, brief, practical signposts in their shared silence. She found herself watching his hands, the way they handled the reins with a gentle authority, the way they could build a fire with an almost delicate precision. They were strong, calloused hands, but they were not cruel. Late in the afternoon of the third day, he turned the roan into a narrow, almost hidden cleft in a wall of red rock. The entrance was choked with mesquite and juniper, a place one could easily ride past 100 times and never notice. They traveled down a winding sandy wash for a quarter of a mile, the canyon walls rising steeply on either side, their passage echoing softly in the enclosed space. And then, the canyon opened into a small, secluded bowl of land, a secret oasis hidden from the world, a thin ribbon of a creek, lined with cottonwoods whose leaves trembled in the breeze. Cut across a patch of green grass, tucked against the far wall of the canyon, nestled in the long afternoon shadow of the cliff face, was a cabin. It was small and rough, built of thick, dark logs chinked with mud. It had the look of a place that had been forgotten by time, its wood weathered to a silver gray by years of sun and wind. But as they drew closer, Clarabelle saw signs of new life. The stone chimney at one end was solid, with no crumbling mortar. One half of the roof was covered in fresh-cut cedar shingles, their raw, woody scent faint on the air. The door was made of thick, newly planed planks, a stark contrast to the ancient wood of the walls. This was not a ruin. It was a restoration. It was a place being slowly, patiently reclaimed from the wilderness. She realized then that this man had not been a perpetual drifter. He had been a man with a project, a purpose that had been interrupted by his journey to Dust Hollow. He had been building a place to stop wandering. He dismounted, and this time, when he looked up to help her down, she did not wait. She slid off the horse herself, her feet landing solidly on the ground. She felt a profound and inexplicable sense of arrival, as if she had been traveling toward this hidden place her entire life. The cowboy led the horse to the creek for a long drink before unsaddling it and setting it to graze on the lush grass. He did not immediately go inside. Instead, he picked up an axe that was leaning against the wall and began to split firewood from a small pile of logs, his movements economical and powerful, the sharp thwack of the steel echoing off the canyon walls. Clarabelle stood uncertainly for a moment, feeling like an intruder. This was his sanctuary, his private world. What was her place in it? She could not stand here forever, a silent, useless observer. The habits of a lifetime of work, of earning her keep, were too deeply ingrained. She looked at the cabin. The new door was solid, but the single window was covered in grime, and a film of dust lay over everything she could see through the murky glass. She looked at the stone hearth inside, cold and black. Making a decision, she began to move. She found a stiff, leafy branch from a fallen juniper and, entering the cabin, began to sweep. The interior was sparse, almost monastic. A simple cot with a folded blanket stood against one wall. A rough-hewn table and a single three-legged stool were the only furniture. The air was thick with a smell of dust, old ashes, and disuse. As she swept, the dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting through the dirty window, and the floor of packed earth began to reappear from beneath its gray blanket. She worked methodically, a familiar rhythm that eased the tension in her shoulders. When the floor was as clean as she could make it, she gathered kindling from the pile outside and laid a fire in the hearth. She had no flint and steel, so she arranged it and waited. The cowboy, having finished his wood-cutting, came inside. He saw her work, the swept floor, the prepared hearth. His gaze lingered for a moment on the neat pile of kindling. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of her effort. He then took his own flint from his pouch and, with a few sharp strikes, brought a shower of sparks onto the tinder. A tiny flame licked, caught, and grew, and soon a cheerful fire was crackling in the fireplace, pushing back the chill of the encroaching evening and filling the small space with a warm, flickering light. They fell into a silent routine over the next few days. He worked outside, reinforcing a section of the wall, mending a leather harness, or clearing stones from a small patch of ground near the creek that might, one day, be a garden. She worked inside, scrubbing the window until it let in the clear canyon light, finding a small clay pot and filling it with wildflowers, and learning the temperament of the fireplace to cook their simple meals of beans and salted meat. They did not speak, yet they communicated constantly. If he saw the water bucket was low, he would return from the creek with it full. If she saw his axe was dull, she would find the whetstone and set it by the chopping block. They moved around each other with a quiet, unconscious grace. Two solitary people building a shared life out of small, unspoken gestures. But it was his attentiveness to her, specifically, that began to slowly, painstakingly dismantle the walls she had built around her heart. One afternoon, as she was kneading dough for bread on the table, he sat by the fire, carving a piece of cottonwood with his knife. She had been on her feet for hours, and her back ached. When he was finished, he did not show her his work. He simply stood up and placed what he had made near the hearth, a new, sturdy, four-legged stool, taller and more comfortable than the other one. He placed it in the spot where she often stood to stir the pot over the fire. It was a chair, made for her, a silent invitation to rest. Another time, a sudden, cold wind swept down the canyon, rattling the door and sending a chill through the cabin. Clarabelle shivered, pulling her thin shawl tighter. The cowboy was outside. When he returned a short while later, he carried a small, heavy pot, which he placed on the hearthstones to warm. It was filled with water. It was not for drinking or cooking. He had seen her shiver, had felt the cold wind, and had heated water so she might have the comfort of washing her face and hands in its warmth. Each of these gestures was a small, quiet shock. She had spent her life being treated as an inconvenience or a tool, her needs and comforts entirely irrelevant. To be considered, to have her unspoken needs anticipated and met without a word being said, was a language she had never known. It was a form of kindness so profound it left her feeling breathless and unsteady. The culmination of these silent kindnesses came a week after their arrival. The days of travel and hard work had left her feeling caked in a layer of grime that felt almost permanent. That afternoon, while he was gone, likely checking snares he had set further up the canyon, she decided she could not bear it another moment. She took a piece of soap she had found in his saddlebags and went down to the creek. The water was shockingly cold, but the need to feel clean was stronger. She washed her face, her arms, and her hair, scrubbing away the last traces of dust hollow and the long road. Shivering, her hair dripping cold water down her back, she stood and turned to head back to the cabin, and she stopped. On a large, flat rock near the creek's edge, a rock that had been empty when she arrived, sat a small square of clean, dry cloth. It was a piece of an old flour sack, washed and softened with use. It wasn't large or fine, but it was clean, and it was dry. He must have returned while she was washing, seen what she was doing, and left it for her. He had not announced his presence, had not made her feel watched or exposed. He had simply seen her need and provided for it, quietly and respectfully, before disappearing again. Clarabelle stood there, dripping and cold, and stared at the small white square of fabric. It was just a towel, a simple, practical object. But in that moment, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was a chair when she was tired. It was hot water when she was cold. It was half a loaf of bread when she was starving. It was a gold coin on a dirty table. It was a silent gaze that saw a person, not an object. It was everything. She reached out a trembling hand and touched it. The fabric was soft and dry against her cold, wet fingers. And as she picked it up, something inside her that had been frozen solid for years finally broke. A single, hot tear slid down her cheek, followed by another and another. Soon, she was crying, not with the loud, gulping sobs of grief or fear, but with a silent, steady stream of tears that she could not, and did not want to, stop. She was not crying because she was sad. She was not crying because she was scared or lonely. She was crying because for the first time in her memory, someone had seen her not as a mouth to feed, a body to be used, or a problem to be solved, but simply as a person who might get cold, a person who might be tired, a person who, after washing in a cold creek, would need a towel. The sheer, overwhelming simplicity of that consideration was what undid her. She pressed the rough, clean cloth to her face, and her tears soaked into it. A quiet baptism in a hidden canyon, marking the end of one life and the fragile, uncertain beginning of another. The week that followed was one of quiet healing. The hidden canyon became Clarabelle's entire world, and for the first time, it was a world that felt safe. The routines she and the cowboy had established became a comforting liturgy. Each sunrise, she would fetch water from the creek, the morning air crisp and clean against her skin. Each evening, she would watch the firelight dance on the rough-hewn logs of the cabin walls, a warm and steady heartbeat in the vast wilderness. The raw, open wounds on her wrists healed, fading into pale, silvery scars. But the deeper healing was taking place inside, in the quiet spaces where fear had taken root. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for years began to recede, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. She learned the landscape of his silence. She could tell by the set of his shoulders if the hunt had been successful. She could read the subtle shift in his eyes that meant a storm was gathering in the high peaks to the west. He, in turn, learned hers. He seemed to know when the memories of the Black Creek camp flickered behind her eyes, and on those evenings, he would stay up late, silently sharpening a tool or mending a piece of tack by the fire, his steadfast presence a wordless reassurance that she was no longer in that place. He had asked nothing of her, and in doing so, had given her everything, the freedom to simply be. He had given her a sanctuary, and she had begun to think of it as home. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. The air was warm, and the canyon was filled with the drowsy hum of bees in the wildflowers she had planted near the door. Clarabelle was inside, scrubbing the tabletop with sand and water, humming a half-forgotten tune from her childhood. The cowboy was down by the creek, methodically sharpening the blade of his axe on a whetstone. It was a scene of such profound domestic tranquility that the sound, when it came, felt like a violation, a tearing of the very fabric of their world. It was the sound of multiple horses, their hooves clattering on the rocky ground at the entrance to the canyon wash. It was not the slow, ambling sound of a lone rider. This was the sound of men in a hurry, of purpose and aggression. The cowboy stopped his work instantly. His head came up, his body going utterly still, a predator sensing a threat. He laid the axe and stone aside and rose to his feet in one fluid motion. His eyes, fixed on the canyon mouth, were flat and hard as river stones. Clarabelle, drawn by the sudden silence, appeared in the cabin doorway, her hands dripping, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She knew that sound. She had heard it before, in the moments before the trackers had found her. He did not look at her, but his left hand made a small, sharp gesture. "Stay inside." Then he walked, not with his usual unhurried pace, but with a long, ground-eating stride, to stand directly in front of the cabin door. He did not reach for the rifle that was leaning just inside the frame. He did not draw the hunting knife at his belt. He simply stood there, his feet planted wide, his arms loose at his sides. He became a human wall, a silent sentinel guarding the entrance to their small, shared life. Moments later, they appeared, 4 riders, their horses blowing hard, their faces grim with effort and malice. Leading them was Silas Croft. His face was redder, angrier than she remembered, his eyes burning with a possessive fury. Beside him were Jebediah and Bartholomew, and a 4th man, older, with a mean, pinched face, whom she vaguely recognized from the mining camp. They pulled their horses to a halt 20 feet from the cabin, kicking up a cloud of dust that seemed to profane the clean air. "Well, well," Silas sneered, his gaze sweeping over the tidy cabin, the small pile of neatly stacked firewood, and finally settling on the immovable man blocking the door. "Found yourself a cozy little nest. Did you, playing house?" He swung down from his horse, the leather of his saddle groaning in protest. In his hand, he held a familiar, dog-eared piece of paper, the contract. "We're not here for you. Mute!" Silas spat, his voice loud and ugly in the quiet canyon. "We're here for what's ours. We have a legal, binding document here." He shook the paper for emphasis. "This document says the girl, Clarabelle, is the property of the Black Creek mining concern until her debt is paid in full. That little show you put on in town with your gold piece was a farce, a disruption of a legal proceeding. We've spoken with a circuit judge over in Purgatory. He agrees. The original contract holds precedence." It was a lie. Clarabelle knew instinctively. There was no judge. This was just brute force and intimidation, dressed up in the flimsiest of legal threats. But the sight of that paper, the sound of his voice declaring her his property, sent a wave of ice-cold terror through her. Her breath hitched. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress, now seemed fragile, a box of sticks that could be kicked down. The world tilted back to the horror of the dust-hollow market square. The cowboy did not move. He did not speak. His silence was no longer placid. It was charged, heavy, and dangerous. It absorbed Silas's angry words and gave nothing back, and his lack of reaction seemed to enrage the foreman even more. "Ah, did you hear me, you deaf fool?" Silas shouted, taking a step forward. "We're here to collect our property. Stand aside, or we'll move you aside." He and the other men spread out, a clear and imminent threat of violence. Behind the cowboy's broad back, Clarabelle trembled. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to retreat into the darkest corner of the cabin and pray this nightmare would end. This was men's business, violent, ugly business. Her role was to be the prize, the object to be fought over. Her opinion was worthless. Her voice did not matter. That was the lesson the world had taught her over and over again. But as she stood there, shaking in the shadows of the cabin, something else rose up to meet the fear. It was the memory of the past week, the memory of the shared bread, the memory of the warm water on a cold day, the memory of the clean towel left for her by the creek. She looked at the strong, straight line of the cowboy's back. He was standing between her and them, a silent shield. He had not bought a piece of property. He had freed a person. He had treated her not as an object, but as an equal. And if he saw her that way, how could she see herself as anything less? To stay hidden now would be to agree with Silas Croft. It would be to accept that she was, in fact, nothing more than a thing to be claimed. It would be a betrayal of the man who stood before her, and a betrayal of the fragile, brave person she was becoming. Her terror was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping her throat, but her resolve was a tiny, hot coal in her belly, and she fanned it with every ounce of her will. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she stepped out of the shadows. She moved around the cowboy's unmoving form and stood beside him, in the full, harsh light of the afternoon. She was small, and she was unarmed. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. But she stood tall, lifted her chin, and met Silas Croft's furious, astonished gaze. The miners all stopped, taken aback by her sudden appearance. They had expected to deal with the man. The girl was not supposed to be part of the equation. Clarabelle's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it cut through the tense silence with the shocking force of a ringing bell. "I am not a thing," she said, her eyes locked on Silas. The words felt strange and powerful on her tongue. "I am not property. You cannot own a person." Silas stared at her, his mouth agape for a second before twisting into a contemptuous sneer. "You don't get a say in this, girl. This is a matter of law." "This is a matter of my life," Clarabelle countered, her voice gaining strength. "That paper is a lie. My father sold me to pay his own debts. That is not a contract. And that debt was paid. I saw it. Everyone in Dust Hollow saw it paid." She took another step forward, her fear burning away, replaced by a righteous fury she had never known she possessed. "I am not going back," she said, her voice ringing with finality. She turned her head slightly and looked at the cowboy, at his strong, silent profile. Then she looked back at Silas Croft. "I choose to be here," she declared, her voice rising. "With him." The words hung in the air, simple, absolute, and irrefutable. It was a declaration of independence, delivered in a hidden canyon in front of 5 men and a universe of silent stone. It changed everything. Silas's legal pretext, flimsy as it was now utterly shredded. They could not claim to be repossessing a fugitive when the fugitive was standing right there, declaring her free will. To take her now would not be law. It would be kidnapping, a crime with a swift and final punishment. Silas Croft's face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, rage, and finally, sputtering, impotent fury. He was a bully, and his primary weapon, the assumption of his victim's powerlessness, had just been taken from him. He had no response. He looked to his men, but they were shifting uncomfortably, their bluster gone. They were hard men, but they were not fools. They could see the line that had just been drawn in the dust. "This is nonsense," Silas stammered, his voice losing its conviction. "She doesn't know what she's saying." It was the old man who finally broke the standoff. He had been watching the entire exchange with a look of sour appraisal. He hawked and spat a thick wad of tobacco juice onto the ground near Clarabelle's feet. "She knows what she's saying. Silas," the old man rasped, his voice full of gravel and disgust. "The fight's gone out of her for you. You can't drag a body back that ain't got a soul willing to follow. It's bad luck." He looked from Clarabelle's defiant face to the cowboy's stony silence. He shook his head, a look of contempt on his pinched features. He turned his gaze on the cowboy. "She's yours, then mute," he sneered, making the word yours sound like a curse. "Enjoy the broken goods." With a final, disgusted glare, he turned his horse around. Bartholomew and Jebediah, looking almost relieved, quickly followed suit. Silas Croft stood there for a moment longer, his chest heaving, his face a mask of thwarted rage. He looked as if he wanted to say more, to do more, but the moment had passed. He had lost, defeated. He spun around, yanked himself onto his horse, and spurred the animal cruelly, galloping away without a backward glance. Clarabelle stood and watched them go, the thunder of their hooves fading down the wash until it was gone, leaving only the gentle whisper of the wind and the hum of the bees. The silence they left behind was different from the one they had broken. It was deeper, richer. It was the silence of a battle won, of a sanctuary successfully defended. She was still trembling, the adrenaline slowly draining out of her, leaving her feeling weak and hollowed out. She turned and looked up at the cowboy. He had not moved, had not flinched. He was still the wall. But as she met his gaze, he slowly, finally, relaxed his stance. His eyes, which had been so hard, softened. He looked from her face down to the ground where the old man had spat, and then back to her. He raised one hand, not to touch her, but just held it in the space between them for a moment. Then he gave a single, slow nod. It was not praise, it was not thanks. It was something more. It was respect, in his silent language. It was the loudest, most meaningful word she had ever heard. The departure of Silas Croft and his men left a stillness in the canyon that was different from the peace that had preceded it. It was a quiet, born not of isolation, but of victory. A boundary had been drawn and defended. Clarabelle felt it in the very air she breathed. It was lighter, cleaner, as if a storm she hadn't known was gathering had finally broken and passed. In the days that followed, the unspoken language between her and the cowboy deepened into a comfortable, easy kinship. The shadow of her past, of being owned and pursued, had finally lifted, and in its place, the future began to feel like a real and tangible thing. Summer softened, its brutal, bleaching sun relenting as the season turned. The air in the mornings grew a sharp, clean edge to it, and the light that spilled into the canyon in the late afternoons took on a golden, syrupy quality. The leaves of the cottonwoods by the creek, which had been a dusty green, began to burnish at the edges, turning the color of old coins. Autumn was coming, and with it came a shared, unspoken sense of purpose. They were no longer just surviving. They were preparing. They were building. The small patch of cleared earth by the creek, which Clarabelle had first seen as a hopeful gesture, became her domain. The cowboy had turned the soil for her with a shovel he had painstakingly fashioned from a flat rock and a sturdy branch. She, in turn, learned the rhythms of the earth. She planted wild onions she found growing in a shady patch upstream and transplanted the tubers of hardy prairie turnips they had dug on a foraging trip. Her hands, which had once been raw from rope, were now perpetually stained with rich, dark soil. She learned to read the sky for rain and the ground for moisture. The small, stubborn garden was a testament to her faith in tomorrow, a belief that they would be here to see the harvest. While she coaxed life from the ground, he worked with wood and stone, shoring up their fortress against the coming cold. He finished the roof, the neat rows of cedar shingles finally covering the entire structure. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer was the canyon's daily music, a sound of permanence and security. He replaced the jury-rigged door latch with a proper wooden bar that slid home with a satisfying, solid thud. He built a small, sturdy shelf inside the cabin for her to store dried herbs and roots. His hands, which could be so strong with an axe, proving to be remarkably deft and precise with a knife, he worked with a quiet, relentless focus. Each nail he drove, each log he notched, a silent promise against the winter winds. They worked, not as master and servant, but as partners in a silent enterprise. There was a cadence to their days, a seamless flow of shared labor. When he returned from hunting with a pair of rabbits, she would have a fire ready and a pot of water simmering. When he mended the horse's tack, she would bring him a cup of hot, weak tea brewed from juniper needles. They communicated in a language of finished tasks and anticipated needs. A full wood box was a conversation. A mended shirt left folded on his cot was a reply. Their life was a tapestry woven without a single spoken word, each gesture a thread of mutual care and reliance. One evening, as the first true chill of autumn settled in the canyon, they sat by the fire. The day's work was done. A savory stew of rabbit and wild vegetables bubbled in the pot over the flames, filling the small cabin with a warm, comforting aroma. Outside, the wind whispered through the high pines, a lonely, mournful sound. The cowboy was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and practiced. The soft scrape of the oiled cloth on the steel a familiar, peaceful sound. Clarabelle was mending a tear in her dress, the only one she owned. Her mind was quiet, her thoughts as gentle as the flickering firelight. Without conscious thought, a tune began to form on her lips. It was a simple, rambling melody, a half-remembered lullaby her own mother had hummed to her in a life so distant it felt like a dream. She wasn't performing. It was the unconscious sound of a soul at peace. She hummed a few bars. Then, feeling the simple comfort of the melody, she began to sing the words. her voice little more than a whisper, soft and hesitant. "Hush now, little darling. The sun has gone to sleep. The stars are watching over. No need for you to weep." She stitched and sang, lost in the simple, sad beauty of the old song. And then she felt a change in the room. The rhythmic scraping of the cloth on the rifle had stopped. The air, which had been filled with the small, comfortable sounds of their evening routine, was suddenly utterly still. She looked up. The cowboy had frozen. He sat on his stool, the rifle laying across his lap. Forgotten. His hands were still. He was staring into the fire, but his gaze was distant, seeing something far beyond the dancing flames. His face, usually a mask of calm impassivity, was etched with an emotion she had never seen there before. It was a look of profound, heart-wrenching sorrow, a deep and ancient grief that seemed to rise from the very core of him. Fearing she had disturbed him, that her small song had broken their peaceful quiet in some unwelcome way, she let the words die in her throat. The silence rushed back in, thick and heavy. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling loud and clumsy. "I didn't mean to—" He slowly turned his head, his eyes moving from the fire to her face. She saw the reflection of the flames dancing in their dark depths. His lips, framed by the thick beard, parted slightly. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, a sound came from him. It was a voice, rough and low, unused, like the rasp of a rusty hinge being forced open for the first time in years. "That song," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. He cleared his throat, the sound raw. "My mother, she used to sing it." The words, so simple, so few, struck Clarabelle with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, her needle forgotten in her hand, her heart seeming to stop in her chest. For months, he had been a creature of absolute silence. She had built a whole life around that silence, learned its contours and its meanings. She had, in some corner of her mind, come to believe that he was truly unable to speak, that some past violence or sickness had stolen his voice. But here it was, a voice, and it was sharing a piece of himself, a memory, a wound. She didn't know what to say. The world had just been remade. The man she thought she knew was suddenly a stranger again, but a stranger who had just handed her the key to a locked room inside himself. A slow smile spread across her face, an expression of pure, unadulterated wonder. And as she smiled, her eyes filled with tears. They were not tears of sorrow or of pity. They were tears of a profound and overwhelming joy, a release of a tension she hadn't even known she was carrying. It was the joy of a door opening, of a connection finally given a name. The dam of her own guarded emotions broke, and the tears spilled over, tracing warm paths through the dust on her cheeks. She did not try to hide them. He watched her, his expression unreadable for a moment. And then a flicker of something understanding, perhaps even relief, softened the hard lines around his eyes. From that night on, the silence was different. It was no longer an absolute state, but a choice, a preference. He did not become a talkative man. His words remained rare and precious, like nuggets of gold panned from a wide, quiet river. They were almost always short, practical things, observations of the world around them. "Wind's turning," he might say, his eyes on the clouds gathering over the canyon rim. "More rain coming," he would murmur, after examining the leaves of a cottonwood tree. "The wood is dry," he stated once, after she had stacked the firewood he'd chopped, and the simple praise made her feel warmer than the fire itself. Each sentence, no matter how mundane, was a gift. It was another small piece of himself, another thread in the tapestry they were weaving. His voice, though still rough from disuse, was a low and steady sound, as comforting as the thud of his axe or the solid thud of the bar on the door. It was the sound of safety. And with his voice came a change in Clarabelle. The vague, formless contentment she had found in the canyon began to coalesce into something sharper, more daring hope. She started to dream of things she hadn't allowed herself to imagine for years. She dreamed of a winter spent by the fire, of a garden that bloomed in the spring. She dreamed of a life that was not about running or hiding, but about building and growing. She dreamed of one day hearing his voice say her name. The thought was so audacious, so filled with a terrifying, beautiful possibility, that it made her heart ache. He had given her freedom. He had given her safety. He had given her a home. And now, with a few sparse words, he had given her back the permission to dream of a future where she was not just a survivor, but a woman with a name that might one day be spoken with love. The passing of the seasons in the hidden canyon was marked by subtle, profound shifts. The gold of the cottonwoods deepened to a burnt orange. Then the leaves fell, carpeting the ground in a rustling blanket. The creek, once a lazy ribbon of water, ran faster and colder, its voice a higher, sharper murmur. The first snows dusted the high peaks, a stark white warning against the deep blue of the autumn sky. Inside the small cabin, life had found its own steady, quiet rhythm, a warmth that defied the growing chill outside. The journey into Dust Hollow was his idea. It came on a morning so cold that their breath plumed in the air inside the cabin. He had been staring out the newly cleaned window, his gaze fixed on the snow-capped mountains to the east. Clarabelle was packing dried meat into small cloth bags, a winter's provision. "Need supplies," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Salt, flour. Can't make it through the winter on just meat and roots." Clarabelle stopped her work, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Dust Hollow. The name itself was a bitter taste in her mouth. They had everything they needed here: safety, peace, a fragile, growing happiness. To return to that place of judgment and cruelty felt like tempting a fate they had been fortunate enough to escape. As if sensing her hesitation, he added, "They have the lantern night. Soon, an old custom." He turned from the window to look at her. "It is a thing to see." She understood then. This wasn't just about salt and flour. This was about more than survival. He was offering her a piece of the world they had forsaken, a night of light in the coming darkness of winter. It was a test, for both of them. A chance to walk back into that town not as a captive and a mysterious outcast, but as two people with a right to be there, to witness a small beauty, to buy their goods and return home. It was a terrifying and strangely exhilarating prospect. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll go." They spent 2 days preparing. He repaired a loose shoe on the roan, while she worked on their appearance. She took the 2 softest flour sacks from their dwindling supply and, with painstaking care, soaked and scrubbed them until they were a creamy, unblemished white. She cut and stitched by the firelight, her fingers growing numb, until she had fashioned a simple, clean dress. It had no lace, no adornments, but it was whole and untorn. It was the first new garment she had owned in years. On the morning they were to leave, she brushed her hair until it shone, then braided it into a single, thick plait that hung down her back. When she looked at her faint reflection in a pail of water, she saw not the ragged, terrified girl from the market square, but a stranger, a woman, plain and serious, but with a quiet dignity in her eyes. They arrived in Dust Hollow as twilight was falling. The town was transformed. The harsh, sun-bleached angles of the buildings were softened by a purple dusk, and the main street, usually a place of grim commerce, was alive with people and light. Lanterns hung from every porch and awning, paper lanterns of all shapes and colors, casting a warm, magical glow over everything. The air, crisp with the coming frost, smelled of pine smoke from bonfires and the sweet, tempting aroma of baked apples. A fiddle played a lively tune from the steps of the general store, and the sound of laughter, a sound she had never associated with this place, floated on the air. For a moment, walking beside him as he led the horse, Clarabelle allowed herself to be swept up in the magic. She was just a woman in a town celebrating a holiday. They were anonymous. Two faces among many who had come in from the outlying ranches and mining camps for this rare night of community. They bought their flour and their salt. The transaction with Mr. Finch at the general store blessedly brief and impersonal. With their saddlebags filled, their purpose in town was complete. They could leave now, melt back into the wilderness. But the cowboy did not turn the horse toward the edge of town. Instead, he tethered the roan to a hitching post and gestured with his head toward the center of the square, where the largest bonfire burned and the crowd was thickest. He wanted to stay. He wanted to see the lights. Fear, cold and familiar, pricked at her. To be in a crowd was to be seen. But she looked at his face, illuminated by the soft lantern light, and saw a quiet determination in his eyes. He was not forcing her. He was inviting her to be brave. She gave a small nod, and he offered her his arm. Hesitantly, she took it, the rough wool of his coat a solid, comforting anchor. They walked into the heart of the festival. They stood at the edge of the crowd, watching families laugh and children chase each other with small, glowing lanterns. The fiddler played on, and a few couples began to dance in the open space, their boots stomping a rhythmic beat on the hard-packed earth. For a quarter of an hour, they were invisible, and Clarabelle's fear began to ebb, replaced by a shy, tentative wonder. Then it happened. A woman passed by, her arm linked with her husband's. It was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, her face a familiar mask of sour piety. Her eyes swept the crowd, and for a moment, they passed over Clarabelle without recognition. Then, she looked again, a flicker of memory, and then her eyes widened in dawning comprehension. She stopped, pulling her husband to a halt. She leaned in and whispered something to him, her gaze fixed on Clarabelle, her lips curled in disdain. The man, the preacher, looked. His eyes were cold and judgmental. He whispered something back. The poison began to spread. The couple next to the Gables noticed their fixed stare and followed it. A man standing nearby turned. A whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves, began to move through the crowd. That's the one. The girl from the camp. The runaway. With him. The mute. The stares were not just curious glances. They were sharp, piercing things, laden with the weight of past judgments. They were looks that stripped her of her clean dress and her neat braid, dressing her once more in the rags of her public shaming. The warmth of the bonfire seemed to vanish, and a profound, isolating chill settled over her. The happy sounds of the festival faded into a dull roar. The 100 eyes of Dust Hollow had found them again. Clarabelle's first instinct was to flee. She wanted to pull her arm from his, to turn and run into the darkness, to find the horse and ride until this town was nothing but a bad memory. Her breath grew shallow. The square began to feel like a cage, just as it had before. She felt a pressure on her arm. He was squeezing it gently, a firm, steady reassurance. She looked up at him. He was not looking at the crowd. He was looking down at her, and his eyes were calm. There was no fear in them, no anger. There was only a quiet, unshakable presence. His gaze said, without a word, "I am here. You are not alone." His strength flowed into her. The memory of his quiet kindnesses in the canyon, the shared bread, the warm water, the chair he had built for her rose up in her mind, a bulwark against the tide of shame. She was not that girl anymore. She was not a piece of property, a runaway to be gawked at and whispered about. She was a woman who had built a home, tended a garden, and found a life in the wilderness. She had made a choice that day, and she had never, for one moment, regretted it. The crowd expected her to shrink, to hide her face and pull him away. They expected shame. She would not give it to them. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled her arm from his. He let her go, his eyes questioning. She took a single step forward, out from the protective shadow of his body, into the full, flickering light of the bonfire. The whispers faltered, replaced by a confused silence as she became the center of attention. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drumbeat of fear and defiance. She scanned the sea of faces, the curious, the scornful, the indifferent. They were all watching, waiting to see what the runaway girl would do. Then, just as she had done all those months ago, she lifted her hand. It did not tremble this time. It rose with a slow, steady grace, and in the sudden, breathless hush of the town square, under the soft glow of 100 paper lanterns, she lifted one finger. She pointed. She pointed directly at the cowboy. It was the same gesture, but the meaning was a universe apart. The first time, it had been a desperate, silent scream for rescue, the last gamble of a terrified soul. This time, it was a declaration. It was not a plea, but a proclamation. It was not a question, but an answer. Her finger did not waver. It pointed with the unshakable certainty of a compass needle finding north. It said, "This is my place. This is my choice. This is my home." A wave of confusion rippled through the crowd. They remembered this. They had seen this before, but it did not make sense now. She was not in chains. She was not in danger. The cowboy stood watching her, his face illuminated by the fire. He saw her gesture, and he understood its new, powerful language. He saw her claim him, freely and proudly, in front of the very people who had condemned them both. And this time, he did not stand still. He took a step forward, closing the small distance she had created between them. He reached out and took her hand, the one that was pointing at him. He gently enclosed her outstretched finger in his strong, warm grip, a silent acceptance of her statement. Then, he did not release her. He held on, and with a slight, inexorable pressure, he drew her back to his side. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and held it there, his message to the 100 watching eyes as clear and undeniable as her own. She was not behind him to be protected, or in front of him to be claimed. She was beside him, an equal, a partner. Together, they stood in the center of the square, bathed in the light of the fire and the lanterns. The whispers did not resume. The stares lost their sharp, judgmental edge, softening into looks of grudging awe, of stunned comprehension. They were not two outcasts hiding from the world. They were a man and a woman who had faced the world and chosen each other. And in that moment, under the silent, watchful gaze of the town, they were more a part of the community than anyone. They had turned their own story of shame into a legend of defiance, and the 100 eyes of Dust Hollow had no choice but to bear witness. The ride back from Dust Hollow was quiet, but it was a different silence from the one on their first journey. The earlier silence had been a void, a space filled with uncertainty and fear. This new silence was a vessel, full of a shared, unspoken understanding. It was the quiet of two people who had stood together in the light and had not been found wanting. Clarabelle no longer sat stiffly in front of him. She allowed herself to lean back slightly, to feel the steady, solid warmth of his chest. His arm, which rested near her, would occasionally brush against hers, and the contact was no longer a source of alarm, but a small, grounding comfort. They rode under a canopy of stars so bright and cold they seemed to crackle in the immense blackness. And for the first time, Clarabelle did not feel like a fugitive running from the world, but like a traveler on her way home. Winter came not as a visitor, but as a conqueror. One morning they awoke to a world erased, buried under a thick, soundless blanket of snow. The canyon, once a place of red rock and golden leaves, was now a study in white and shadow. The creek was a dark, sluggish artery moving beneath shelves of ice. The wind, which had once whispered, now howled, a lonely and ceaseless voice that scoured the high canyon walls. They were snowed in, the narrow entrance to their sanctuary sealed by drifts taller than a man. The world beyond ceased to exist. Their universe shrank to the 4 log walls of the cabin, the steady glow of the fire, and each other. What could have been a prison became a crucible, a place where their quiet partnership was forged into something stronger, more resilient. The days took on a new, more intimate rhythm. Time was measured not by the sun, which was often obscured by a sky the color of lead, but by the simple, necessary tasks of survival. In the mornings, he would brave the biting cold to chop wood and check his snares, returning with his beard and hat frosted with ice, his face numb, but often with a rabbit or two for their pot. She would have the fire blazing, a pot of hot water ready, and the small cabin would fill with the smells of melting snow, wet wool, and the rich, savory aroma of stew. There was no room for pretense in their small, shared world. They saw each other at their most elemental. They saw the weariness in each other's eyes after a long, cold day, the simple satisfaction of a warm meal, the shared relief when a particularly violent gust of wind passed without rattling the new shingles from the roof. She mended his worn shirt, her stitches small and neat, her head bent in concentration by the firelight. He, in turn, carved a new, stronger handle for her favorite cooking spoon after the old one had cracked, his large hands surprisingly gentle and precise. Words remained a rarity, but they were no longer a necessity. They communicated in the language of action, a dialect of pure intention. A log placed carefully on the fire was a conversation about the falling temperature. A shared blanket adjusted over her shoulders as she slept by the hearth was a sonnet. He found an old, tattered almanac in the bottom of his saddlebags, and in the long, dark evenings, he would sometimes read a passage aloud. His voice was still rough, but it was a steady, calming presence against the howling of the wind. He would read about the phases of the moon, the planting cycles for crops they could not yet grow, the strange and distant weather patterns of the world outside, for Clarabelle, who had never learned to read. These were messages from a foreign land, and she listened with a quiet, rapt attention. One day, he returned from checking his traps with a small, flat-sided bird, its feathers a brilliant blue against the snow. He held it out to her, and his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Mountain bluebird," he said. "First one. Means the winter is breaking." And it was true. In the weeks that followed, the world began to thaw. The relentless howl of the wind softened to a whisper. The sound of dripping water from the eaves became a constant, gentle percussion, a promise of release. The monolithic drifts of snow began to shrink, revealing patches of dark, damp earth beneath. The creek, with a groan and a crack, broke free of its icy prison and began to run fast and full, its voice a joyful, tumbling roar. Life was returning to the canyon, and Clarabelle felt it returning to her, a deep, internal thaw that mirrored the one outside. She began to spend her days by the creek, her hands plunged into the cold, rich soil of her small garden patch. This was her work, her claim on this place. She found the first tender shoots of the wild onions she had planted, their green a shocking, vibrant color against the brown earth. One afternoon, venturing further up the canyon than ever before, she found a sheltered slope where the sun had melted the snow completely, and there, pushing up through the damp leaf litter, were the first wildflowers of the season, small, delicate things with petals the color of the dawn sky, Indian paintbrush and bluebells. They were so fragile, yet so stubbornly alive. With painstaking care, she dug them up, keeping the roots and the surrounding soil intact. She carried them back to the cabin like a precious treasure and planted them in a small, protected plot right beside the front door. It was a foolish, impractical thing to do. They were just weeds, beautiful for a moment, but destined to fade. But to her, they were everything. They were a statement of beauty in a hard world. They were a splash of color against the grim gray of survival. They were roots, put down by choice, in a place she had chosen. She spent the rest of the afternoon tending to them, her hands and dress smudged with dirt, a quiet, joyful humming on her lips. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the canyon floor, the cowboy came to the doorway. He had been gone for most of the day, and she saw he was carrying a piece of smooth, planed wood and his carving knife. He watched her for a long moment as she gently watered her new flowers, a small, unreadable smile hidden in his beard. Then, without a word, he turned his attention to the thick porch post that supported the small roof overhang. He took a hammer and a pair of nails from his tool pouch and, with the two sharp, definitive taps, he affixed the piece of wood to the post. Clarabelle stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, and looked at what he had done. He had carved words into the wood. The letters were not perfect, a little rough and uneven, but they were carved with a deep and certain hand. There were only 2 of them, but they were the 2 most important words in the world. It said, "Our home." The word seemed to shimmer in the golden evening light. It was a word that encompassed the entire, brutal, beautiful journey. The market square and the gold coin, the shared bread in the desert, the silent defense against Silas Croft, the long, quiet winter, the first bluebird of spring. All of it was contained in that one simple word. It was a declaration more powerful than any legal document, a bond stronger than any contract. She stepped onto the threshold of the cabin, the place that was no longer just his shelter, but their home. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile of such pure and profound happiness it made her eyes shine. She reached out and laid her hand flat against the sign, her palm covering the word he had carved. Her fingers traced the rough edges of the letter O, then U, then R. She felt the solid, real wood beneath her touch. It was real. This was real. He stood beside her, his presence a warm and steady comfort. He looked at her hand on the sign, then at her face, at the joyful, tear-bright wonder in her eyes. "Clarabelle," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It was the first time he had ever said her name. The sound of it, in his voice, was a revelation. It was not the name of a runaway or a piece of property. It was her name, spoken with a quiet reverence that made it sound new and beautiful and whole. She turned to him, her smile wavering slightly with the force of her emotion. "You've never told me yours," she whispered. He looked out at the canyon, at the new flowers blooming by the door, at the creek running free and clear. He seemed to look at their whole world, and then his gaze came back to rest on her. "It's Elias," he said. "Elias," she repeated, the name a perfect, fitting sound. In the soft light of the spring morning, they stood together on the threshold, no longer 2 fugitives running from a harsh world. They were 2 people who had found each other in the wilderness, who had been tested by silence and by winter, and who had chosen to build a life from the ground up. They were 2 people who had pointed to one another and declared, in front of all the watching eyes, "This is my home." And spring, in its infinite and tender grace, had forgotten neither of them. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.